Hello to our friends joining us via recording. We are wrapping up lesson number 11 today. To help us with our review of what we covered yesterday, we started with a discussion of what Dr. Ahles likes to do in the morning. So Dr. Ahles is all about her coffee. You'll notice that coffee is highlighted here with a star in many places. But really, let's be honest, my entire routine is all about coffee. So we're going to go through as a class. We worked in group work to try to predict which parts of the brain help us do these things. Let's use this routine to help us remember what different parts of the brain do. So we're going to start over here at the very beginning. In Dr. Ahles' ideal world, what would wake her up in the morning is not an unhappy child. It would be the sun rising. So if Dr. Ahles were to wake up with the sun, first, she would see a bright light and then recognize that what that light was is the sun. Both of these are activities that relate to vision. So when we talk about the process of seeing or vision, your sight, which lobe of the brain has to do with vision, your ability to see? Yeah, exactly. Anything related to vision, we're going to find in the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe. So both the process of first seeing something and then figuring out what it is we're seeing, both of those are things that happen in the occipital lobe of the brain. But remember, when we talk about the functional areas, so in this case, the visual areas, remember that we have a primary visual area and a visual association area. Before we assign these to numbers on our list here, remind me, when I talk about the visual association area, what are some of the ways that you would describe how the visual association area works? What's its goal? The visual association area. What are some thoughts? Yeah, I like that. So talking about things like processing or the idea of connecting the dots. Absolutely. So figuring out or interpreting what it is that you're seeing, that's the job of the visual association area. Actually seeing something where the light first goes in the brain, that's the primary visual area. So when we're looking here at our two things that are part of Dr. Ahles' routine, seeing that bright light and recognizing that that light is the sun, is it number one or number two that I do with my visual association area? Which of these is the association part? Yeah, absolutely. So the process of recognizing that it's the sun, that's my visual association area. Recognizing that it's the sun. Just seeing that bright light, that's my primary visual area at work. Seeing things for the first time. Now, if I woke up with sunlight, I would very quickly realize that I need some coffee. I would make a decision that I need coffee. Things like decisions, things like critical thinking or making predictions, where in the brain would we say those kinds of things happen? Your personality, we could add that to the mix. Yeah, exactly. So all of those are in a part of the brain called the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe. To be a little more specific, but I don't think I made you actually learn this term, I'll toss this out there for you. There's this part called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex. This is the specific part of your brain that really helps you with decision making or kind of weighing the pros and cons, being logical. This is also a part of the brain that doesn't develop until you're like 21 years old. So maybe this is part of why the legal drinking age is a little older, right? Prefrontal cortex, your ability to make good decisions. That's found there in the frontal lobe of the brain, along with your personality, along with a lot of those type traits. All right, we skip down here. I decided to make my coffee. That was a good decision. I'm happy about it. I'm listening for it, and I recognize that it has finished brewing. Now, recognizing this sound, we're no longer talking about visual areas anymore. We are talking about sound. This is going to sound like a harder question than it actually is. When you perceive a sound, what do you call that? When you perceive sounds? Yeah, exactly. Y'all are really afraid. I promise it wasn't as hard of a question as it sounded like. So the process of hearing. When we talk about the process of hearing, just like Kaylin mentioned in the chat for us, hearing is something that we do with the temporal lobe. So the process of hearing, or when we're talking about those sounds, that's worthless. We are talking about the temporal lobe. Let's try again. Temporal lobe. In this case, we are talking specifically about recognizing a sound. So again, we've got that recognizing word coming back. So if I'm recognizing that my coffee pot's done brewing, that's something that I would do with what I call my auditory association area. Auditory association area. Again, it's association because I'm recognizing it. I'm recognizing that the sound that I hear is not a child making noise. I'm recognizing that it's not the TV, it's not my phone buzzing, it's that my coffee is done. Recognizing what it is that I'm hearing, that's the auditory association area. So now that my coffee is done brewing, it is time to pour myself some coffee. When I am pouring myself some coffee, I am using my arms. I'm using the skeletal muscle in my arms to make that happen. The part of my brain that helps me to pour my coffee, yeah, Kaylin's right. We're talking about a motor activity here. So motor activities all come from, or they start in the brain in which lobe? Which lobe does motor input come from? Yeah, exactly. Motor stuff is that frontal lobe, right? Everything in front of the central sulcus, that's motor, that's reasoning, decision making. So we're talking about the frontal lobe. In particular, when we're talking about moving our skeletal muscles, Fanshan's totally right. We're talking about the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus, that's the place where we had the motor homunculus. So that bump in front of the central sulcus, that's where the directions for pouring my coffee come from. So I'm pouring that coffee, it's in my cup. Now it's time to smell. When we talk about smelling, which lobe of the brain helped me out with smelling? Who does smell? Yeah, so smell is the temporal lobe. Smell is the temporal lobe. We do use the insula. Tamiteo mentioned the insula. The insula helps me out with taste. I'll add that to my list here at the bottom. Tasting that coffee. That's the insula for me. So smelling and tasting. Both of these, I'm not telling you anything about what I smell and taste, just the fact that I'm doing it. So we would probably say that this is going to what we call the primary olfactory area, the primary olfactory area. Although if I'm smelling my coffee and recognizing that I didn't brew it nearly strong enough, which happens more often than you'd think, that would be something that I would say would be my olfactory association area. When I'm interpreting that smell to say, ooh, that is weak coffee. Or to say, ooh, we brewed the Starbucks stuff today. It's a good day. That's the work of the association area. So when we smell it, just up front smell it, primary olfactory area. When we talk about tasting it, not interpreting that taste, just general taste of it, that would be what we call the primary gustatory area. Gustation is the process of taste. So the primary gustatory area helps me out with taste. The last part of my routine, though, is detecting the temperature of that coffee. And check this out. Apparently, that coffee was really hot. I'm spitting that stuff back out here. When I talk about detecting the temperature of my coffee, where did we decide that this kind of information is going to, or what part of the brain helps me out with this, with detecting the temperature of that coffee? Any ideas? Yeah, exactly. So detecting the temperature is one of the things that we call a general sense or general sensation. Things like taste and smell and vision, those are all special senses. So temperature is a general sense. All of my general sensory stuff goes to the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe, specifically in the parietal lobe, it's that post-central gyrus. Post-central gyrus, where we had the sensory homunculus. So again, because this is general sensory information, that goes to the post-central gyrus. These other kinds of information that we talked about, tasting, smelling, hearing, seeing, all of those are special senses, which is why they go to particular parts or particular lobes in the brain. All right, so we've said the locations where all this stuff happens. Oh yeah, Timmy, got a question?
Yes, I do. So on the test, just in case, if we have a question like this, and then we have options where it says parietal lobe and post-central gyrus, would it be okay if we picked the precentral gyrus because that's where specifically it happens?
Yes. Yeah, so the better answer in general, the better answer is the more specific answer. So in particular, the place where we detect temperature information is the post-central gyrus. We do find it in the parietal lobe, but more specifically, we're finding it here. Same deal when we're talking about the actions here. The frontal lobe is technically broadly correct, but more specifically and more correct is the precentral gyrus. Yeah, good question. Yeah. All right, so we've named the location of all of these things. Really fast then, let's go back to our brain picture here. And we are going to use our picture of the brain to remind ourselves where each of these things happen. So when we talked about number 1 and number 2, number 1 and number 2, these were both in the process of vision. Remind me again which lobe of the brain did vision? Who's doing vision? Yeah, exactly. Vision is in the occipital lobe. So I'm going to put a number 1 and a number 2 back here in the back part of the brain. The primary visual area and the visual association area, the two places we said that did those things, they are right next door to each other in that occipital lobe. So occipital lobe, really important for that. We talked about the process of making a decision being in the prefrontal cortex in the frontal lobe. So making a decision to make that coffee, that's going to be up here in the front, in the frontal lobe. When we talked about recognizing our sound, when we talked about hearing, remember that hearing was something that we did in the temporal lobe. Put a circle around it there. Temporal lobe. Both initially hearing something and figuring out what you'd be hearing. If I had that extra step in there, they'd both be right there in that temporal lobe. Remind me again, for number 5, we talked about pouring the coffee. Which part of the brain did we say we were using to pour that coffee? Yeah, so we're in the frontal lobe. Yeah, so the frontal lobe is where we find that bump called the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus, the bump that is in front of the central sulcus. Yeah, exactly, like Elapina mentioned, this is where we find that motor homunculus. In the bump in front of the central sulcus. That's how I pour my coffee. While we're at it, we'll go next door. What number did we say we used the post-central gyrus for? What number did I use that post-central gyrus for? Yeah, exactly, number 7. So temperature, touch, so texture, pain, that kind of information going there to number 7, to arrow number 7. Where in the body do we do smell? Which part of the brain does smell again? What lobe was that? Yeah, Kira's exactly right. That's also in the temporal lobe. My 6 isn't showing up very well, but number 6 is in there too, in the temporal lobe. And then remember that number 8, tasting that coffee, was deep in the brain in that lobe called the insula. So I'm just gonna put a little arrow, and maybe a little X marks the spot. I don't know. There's where my insula would be. That's the insula down there underneath. So hopefully this review not only helped us to walk through some of those functions, but it also kind of helped us to remember the big picture anatomy of the brain. Any questions about this activity before we move back into some new stuff? Or you can shoot me an emoji. Here, I got emojis coming your way. It's only fitting for me to send you some coffee cups. Oh, good. Yeah, Fanchin said that one made us think. Hey, I like it. That's the goal, right? We want to practice thinking now so that we're ready to keep doing that thinking on the exam. Absolutely. All right, well, let me pull up lesson number 11, and we'll pick up where we left off yesterday. I love it. I'm getting all the fun emojis. That's perfect. Yeah, Audrey is channeling the rain, right? It was raining. It was pretty dark this morning here. Like at 8:30, it was still like almost dark, completely dark outside because it was so cloudy and rainy over here. I don't know if it was like that for you all, but I enjoy the rain. It's kind of nice that we had some rain this morning. That was a nice change. All right, we're going to talk about the remaining parts of the brain that we haven't discussed yet. One of those parts that we haven't discussed yet is the very center part of the brain. This part here in the center is called the thalamus. So the thalamus is all about sorting things, sorting information to where it's supposed to go. So remember how on our activity that we just did here, we talked about how we felt the temperature of our coffee. Feeling the temperature of our coffee, we sent that information to the particular part on the sensory homunculus that interprets information from your tongue. The thalamus helps that information get to the right place. Or when you see something and that information comes here into the thalamus knows that visual information goes back here to the occipital lobe. Or we hear something, the thalamus knows that information goes to the temporal lobe. When you think about the thalamus, one of the first things you should think about it doing is it kind of directs traffic. It's sending information where it needs to go. The other thing that the thalamus does, though, is it also helps to filter that information or kind of edit it to some extent. There is a lot of sensory information that you're getting all the time that you just don't pay attention to. So I always like to joke when we're in person together in a classroom that you don't spend the entire class feeling your shoes. Now, we're going to be honest here. I am not wearing shoes. I don't know if anyone else is. If you are, props to you. I'm sitting here barefoot. But you know what? What I'm not feeling is I'm not feeling my pants. I'm not feeling my shirt. Yeah, none of us are wearing shoes, right? If we were wearing shoes, we'd forget about it. Just like we kind of forget about the fact that we're wearing our clothes. That's because the thalamus gets that sensory information and is like, we don't need to process that consciously. So the thalamus goes through and filters the information. It kind of cuts it out for you. This is particularly helpful, for example, if you're studying in a coffee shop. Here, the noises around you never stop, right? But you don't always consciously perceive them. Unless you're me, and it's really hard for me to work in a coffee shop because you hear things over and you're like, oh, that's really more interesting than studying anatomy. Just gonna be real. Yeah, Audrey calls that mom mode. I like that. Yeah, just ignoring some things. I feel you there. So your thalamus is supposed to help you ignore things. It's supposed to help you switch into mom mode, or switch into I can ignore this mode. Otherwise, the other thing it does is it'll send the information to where it's supposed to go. Yeah, I like it. Online school, no shoes, no problem. And your thalamus is like, heck yes, you can't feel those shoes because they're not there. Remember, too, I had to flash this picture up again because it's just so cool to me. Remember how so many parts of your brain are involved in the process of thinking. So it's that thalamus in the very middle that helps these various parts of the brain communicate with each other. So the information that we're sending to different parts of the brain, or sending back and forth from different parts of the brain, the thalamus is strongly involved in that, making sure that information gets where it needs to go and makes things happen. So thalamus, really involved in sending stuff all over the place. We move down from the thalamus. So we talked about the pineal gland that was back here. In lab, we also called that the epithalamus. It's the same thing. Then we just now talked about our filter, or our sorter. That's the thalamus. Now we're going to move down into the brainstem down below. When you think about the brainstem, again, we should be thinking basic life functions. That's kind of the best way to summarize it. The brainstem is what keeps you alive in the most basic sense. So we're going to find a lot of reflexes here, especially down here in the medulla oblongata, the one that's really close to the spinal cord. Some of our reflexes I've got listed up here. So for example, we have your heart rate. So the medullary rhythmicity center sets your heartbeat. Hopefully it's not beating out of your chest, right? We see both in the pons and the medulla oblongata areas that control your breathing rate. So how quickly we breathe in versus how quickly we breathe out. That comes from both the pons and the medulla oblongata. The medulla also helps us with everyone's favorite reflex, being vomiting. So gotta love that. Medulla, all about reflexes. Big thing with the pons is it helps us out with breathing. The midbrain is really important we mentioned this in lab. I'll get my typing out here. Visual and auditory reflexes. So think about like the startle reflex, essentially. When you jump because you hear something or you see something, that is the work of the midbrain here in the middle. Something that your activity, your outline asks you to do that I'm not going to spend a lot of time today doing, but maybe we can talk about on Monday, is thinking about when a person is in a coma. So when a person is in a coma, oftentimes always they're not conscious. Sometimes they can actually continue to breathe on their own. Their heart continues beating on its own. When you consider the parts of the brain that are and are not working, some of those basic life functions, they're coming here from the brainstem. All the brainstem does is keep you alive. So someone in a coma, we don't actually see these parts of their cerebrum activated. That's what a coma is. You're not conscious. Your cerebrum's not working. But your brainstem may continue to work. If you're not on a ventilator, you're breathing on your own. So your brainstem continues to function. So consider that as you're working on that part of the outline. The brainstem keeps you alive, but only in the most basic sense. Keeps your body physically alive. When we talk about the body being alive, Everywhere in your body needs oxygen, but this is particularly true of your brain. Every time your heart beats, about 20% of all the blood in your body goes up to the brain. The brain, size-wise, compared to the rest of your body, is not 20% of your body, but your brain really, really needs that blood all the time. There's a couple of things that blood has in it that your brain needs. Do we remember what those two things are that blood has that your neurons in particular really need? Exactly. Yep. So first one being oxygen. Every cell in your body needs oxygen. That's what they breathe. Second one, like Kira mentioned, is glucose. Remember, way back on like day number 1, maybe not day 1, but week 1, we talked about how neurons, the brain cells, they can only eat glucose. So every time your heart beats, all that blood we send to the head, its job is to bring oxygen so your neurons can breathe. And its job is to also make sure there's enough glucose in the brain, because that's the only kind of food that those neurons eat. Yeah, so Audrey asked a great question. If this is why we bleed so much when we get a head injury, because there's so much blood going up there. Yeah, that would make a lot of sense to me. You have a lot of blood going toward the head at all times. So those blood vessels are going to have a lot in them. That would make sense to me. Your lesson talked with you about why it is so important for us to constantly have blood flow going to our head. Even if we have an injury, we hope there's still blood flow going up to the head. It is not very long that you can go without blood flow to the head before we start to see some really serious issues. How long is it, or how short, maybe we should say, is it before we start to see brain damage? Yeah, exactly. It's like you got like 5 minutes or less to have no oxygen and no glucose going to the brain. At that point, we start to see neurons starting to die because they don't have oxygen and have glucose. So this is why it's really important to keep, this is why we do CPR, to keep blood going up to the brain. You got, like here mentioned, a 5 to 7 minute window, like 6 minutes, at which point we have been without oxygen and nutrients for too long, and those neurons may start to die. So constant blood flow, very important. A stroke cuts off that blood flow too. So if we have a blood clot in one of these blood vessels, that's why it's so dangerous, because it only takes us about 6 minutes without blood going to that part of the brain before we have permanent irreversible damage. So very important to keep our blood going up there. Most of the blood vessels in the brain are what we call continuous capillaries. Continuous capillaries. Hey, this 100% was lesson number 1 right here. So if you want a reminder, go back to your lesson number 1 notes packet before you knew what you were doing, right? We're all now pros at learning anatomy. But way back in lesson number 1, we talked about these continuous capillaries. Yeah, Kaylin's totally right. Some of the things we talked about in lesson number 1 and talked about again this time was the fact that continuous capillaries don't leak. And that's a good thing for you. We don't want the blood vessels that are going next to your brain where we do all of our important thinking. We don't want those ones to be leaking out bacteria or viruses or metabolic waste. We don't want them leaking. So there's no leaking out of continuous capillaries. They have a continuous layer, so the tissue that lines them, this yellow tissue, no holes at all. And then on the outside of it, we can see this orange layer. This orange layer, like Kaylin mentioned, is made out of those cells called astrocytes. So astrocytes help to form a second coat, if you will, wrapping around the blood vessel, again, to make sure that things can't just leak out of these blood vessels. Now, I am going to give you a study pro tip This is something that you absolutely must write down because I'm promising you this is going to happen. On the exam, I promise you that I am going to ask you what can and cannot cross the blood-brain barrier of the brain. The blood-brain barrier is these two layers of connective tissue that keep the inside of the blood vessels separated from the outside, the brain tissue. I 100% promise you, I'm going to ask you this question. And I 100% promise you, I'm going to give you compounds you've never heard of before. Or I'm going to give you stuff that its name looks scary. But hey, just like way back in unit number 1, where I told you what can and can't cross the plasma membrane, we don't care what it's called. We just care about its chemistry. Same deal when we're thinking about the blood-brain barrier. We don't care about what particular thing I ask you about. If I tell you something is fat soluble or lipid soluble, you know that whatever it is can cross the blood-brain barrier, because the blood-brain barrier is made out of 2 layers of plasma membrane. If this is something that could cross the plasma membrane, it would be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So fat-soluble things or lipid-soluble things that play nice with those lipid tails, they can go straight across, no questions asked. Something like carbon dioxide, which is nonpolar, or oxygen, which is nonpolar. Those things can pass straight through the blood-brain barrier, no issues. Now, when we start talking about things like glucose, that's polar, notice how we have to do transport to get that across. Or amino acids. Amino acids are a little bit large to cross 2 membranes without help. We're going to do some transport on them. If you've got a charge, a plus or a minus, you're going to need help to get across the membrane. And if you're something really large, like a protein or a cell, like we see here, you're not going to cross the blood-brain barrier. So, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Dr. Ahles promises, I will ask you whether or not certain things can get across the blood-brain barrier. All I'm asking you is the chemistry question. If you can cross the plasma membrane of a cell, you can get across the blood-brain barrier, because the blood-brain barrier is basically just 2 plasma membranes of cells we can sneak across. If you could not sneak across a cell's plasma membrane, you can't sneak out or leak out of the blood vessels that we find in the blood-brain barrier. So lipid-soluble things, non-polar things, those are the kind of things that can cross the blood-brain barrier. Polar things, large things, things with a charge, they are not getting across, they're not leaking across the area. We're going to have to use transport proteins to help them. Yeah, so Kaylin's saying it was a blast from the past. It totally is. It's basically the exact same question, just dressed up in new clothes. Now I'm asking you about the blood-brain barrier. I'm not asking you about a plasma membrane, but it's the same question. If your chemistry lets you sneak in and out of a cell, it's going to let you sneak in and out of a blood vessel as well. Yeah, so Tien asked the clarifying question. If we can cross the plasma membrane, we can get across the barrier. That is correct. Yep, that's the way I want you to study it. So go back and review lesson number 4. What was our list of stuff that can and can't get across the membrane? Same rule applies to the blood-brain barrier. Absolutely. Yeah, and Kira asked the clarifying question. When I ask about things, typically, Kira, the way I'm going to phrase it is about diffusing straight through is typically the words I'm going to use. I'll type that for us. Diffusing straight through, or go directly through, or pass directly through. All of these things, the emphasis being on, yes, we're not using proteins. We would not say that a polar something could diffuse. We would not say that a large amino acid chain or a protein, those things couldn't diffuse. So think about diffusion, no proteins allowed. Exactly. So most of the blood vessels in the brain, the vast majority of them, are the blood-brain barrier with these continuous capillaries, so stuff doesn't leak. But we also have some areas in the brain where we have leaky blood vessels, and these areas are called the choroid plexus. So when you think about the choroid plexus, think about these as leaky blood vessels, but they leak for a purpose. The job of the choroid plexus is to make cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid has some good stuff in it, stuff like oxygen or glucose. It's going to have some vitamins. Cerebrospinal fluid helps the brain to stay healthy. It also literally makes the brain lighter. It makes the brain float. So every single ventricle, we studied the ventricles in lab, every single ventricle has some choroid plexus in it. The job of that choroid plexus is to leak out fluid. When that fluid leaves my blood vessel and goes into the ventricles, now it's called cerebrospinal fluid. Yeah, so it's absolutely nourishment, it's cleaning out waste, it's helping out the brain, helping the brain to stay alive. It's important for us to make this cerebrospinal fluid constantly because we're constantly losing it. Remember from lab this week, we talked about the central canal, the cerebrospinal fluid-filled tube in the middle of the spinal cord. So constantly we're losing fluid into that central canal. We're also losing it to the place called the subarachnoid space. Remember from our discussion of the brain too that we had those things called arachnoid granulations or arachnoid villi, where we get rid of that extra cerebrospinal fluid. Biggest picture, you should be making cerebrospinal fluid at the same rate that you're spitting it out. So we should be getting rid of cerebrospinal fluid back into the bloodstream as quickly as we're making it. When we talk about cerebrospinal fluid, as with all the other fluids in the body, it's kind of a circle of life. So you go from being cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricles or that subarachnoid space back into the bloodstream, at which point we call you plasma. And you circulate around in the bloodstream, get some oxygen, go back up to the brain, to the choroid plexus of the brain, at which point that fluid leaks out of the choroid plexus into the ventricles, where we call it cerebrospinal fluid again. So when you're thinking about cerebrospinal fluid, it is the same thing as plasma, except instead of being in a blood vessel, cerebrospinal fluid is found in those ventricles, or it's found in the subarachnoid space. We can get into some issues with cerebrospinal fluid if we don't drain it at the same rate that we make it. So one of the last things that you're studying in this lesson is a condition called hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus literally means water on the brain. Water on the brain. But it's not actually a water problem. Hydrocephalus is a cerebrospinal fluid problem. So if we make a bunch of cerebrospinal fluid and we don't dump that fluid back out, if it's not going into the dural venous sinuses, if it's not going back into the bloodstream, it can build up around the brain in the subarachnoid space. Yeah, and so Kaylin mentioned accurately that hydrocephalus is something that it's serious in anybody, but it's a little bit less serious in children. Children with hydrocephalus, especially babies with hydrocephalus, you'll see this in large size to their head because of the fluid buildup. Why is it? Yeah, well, Kaylin beat me to it. Look at that. Y'all knew where I was going. In babies, hydrocephalus is something that isn't deadly. It's something that we need to treat because it's not good to have extra fluid around your brain. But babies have fontanelles. Remember that fontanelles were squishy, or they were kind of soft spots. They allow for the skull to expand while the brain's growing. Or they allow the skull to expand when there's extra fluid. So hydrocephalus is dangerous. We will absolutely treat it in a child, but it's deadly in adults. And on a little more of a personal note, I actually had a student last semester who emailed me and said that she actually lost her father to hydrocephalus. In adults, if we make extra fluid and we don't have a way to drain that fluid, what's going to end up happening is we're going to end up with pressure on the brain, especially pressure on the brainstem. Remind me, things like the pons and the medulla, those parts of the brainstem, what was their job, those parts of the brain? Yeah, exactly. Kara mentioned those are the parts of the brain that keep you alive. So if we get a lot of pressure on the cerebrum, you might be unconscious. You might not be able to do vision or process sensations. But as long as your brainstem still has space, you're okay. If the brainstem has too much pressure on it as well, that's when we start having issues where we can no longer breathe. We can no longer cause our heart to beat. So hydrocephalus happens when we can't drain enough of that cerebrospinal fluid. There's too much in the ventricles, there's too much in the subarachnoid space, and in adults, we don't have fontanelles to expand out and allow that fluid to go places. Yeah, so Caitlin talked about how we would treat hydrocephalus. Yeah, it's a thing called a cerebral shunt. So a shunt is literally a tube. Here, let's go back a slide here. Literally, we would put a tube into one of these ventricles, and that tube is constantly draining the fluid, a lot of times into the abdominal pelvic cavity. So they'll kind of embed it like right under the skin of the neck, kind of under the skin of the chest cavity, down into the abdominal area, where we can drain that fluid into that cavity, just to make sure it's not building up in the brain. So yeah, using a shunt, we can take the fluid from one place and shunt it or transport it to another place where it's not going to put pressure on the brain. Yeah, exactly. Like Kayla mentioned, it's kind of a lot like a catheter. Absolutely. All right, that is the end of lesson number 11. Do we have any wrap-up questions for lesson number 11? Our chapter on, oh, it's not there, on the brain. How do we feel about the brain? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs in the middle. What do we think? Y'all made me nervous. I was not hearing from anyone. I was like, ah. Yeah, more complicated than you realize, Kaylin. Yeah, there's a lot going on, right? The human brain is fascinating. I was listening to a podcast today about how they actually have found anatomical basis for some personality traits. They did more of those functional MRI studies in people, and they were finding that there were certain ways that people's brains connected to each other. So going from your visual or primary visual area to your visual association area, for example, that looked slightly different in people with differences in personality traits. So I need to listen to the whole podcast because I didn't hear it all. But if it's good, I will pass that along to you all. It sounded very interesting. So the brain is complicated and beautiful and really fun to study. All right, well, I'm going to end this recording. For my friends on the recording, remember that we have to finish up lesson number 11, and our exam number 3 is over lessons 9, 10, and 11. So be looking for the first part of the exam 3 review video. That will be a separate video related to that content.